The patent application hit the floor of the Territorial Land Office with a sound like a gunshot. Annie Thatcher stood in the doorway of that dusty government building in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, in the autumn of 1878, and she watched the clerk, a soft man with ink-stained fingers and a face full of contempt, slide her carefully drafted papers across the counter with the flat of his palm as though they carried some contagion. The pages scattered. 3 weeks of work. 3 weeks of calculations and sketches and mechanical diagrams she had drawn by lamplight while the wind off the Laramie Range battered the walls of her boarding room. "I won't process this," the clerk said. Annie did not flinch. She had been practicing not flinching since she was 9 years old, and her father had told her that mathematics was a man's language, and she should concern herself with bread and mending. She had learned mathematics anyway. She had learned to not flinch, and she had learned to do the thing she was told she could not do, and she had learned to do it better than anyone expected. "You are required by law to process any application meeting the formal criteria," she said. Her voice was steady as the mountains outside. "That application meets every formal criterion. The inventor has to be present to sign the affidavit. I am present. I am the inventor." The clerk looked at her, really looked at her, and she saw the exact moment he decided that what was in front of him was an impossibility his world had no category for. A woman, alone, in Wyoming Territory, with a patent application for a new style of hydraulic sluice gate mechanism that would allow small mining operations to control water flow with a single lever rather than a 3-man crank system. "This is no place for a woman with ideas," he said. The words landed in the room like a second gunshot, and that was the moment Andrew Alden walked through the door behind her. She had not noticed him before. She would later try to remember whether she had seen him outside the office, standing in the sun-washed street with his hat pulled low over dark eyes, but the truth was that she had been so locked in her focus, her armor of purpose, that she had not registered anything outside the scope of her mission. She registered him now. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of weathered hands that came from real labor rather than idleness, and he wore a canvas duster that had seen better seasons. He was not handsome in any conventional, parlor-painting way. He was striking in the way that weather is striking, the kind of face that told a story about the country it had lived in. He stopped. He looked at the papers on the floor. He looked at Annie. He looked at the clerk. "Pick them up," Andrew Alden said to the clerk. The clerk blinked. "I beg your pardon. The lady's papers, pick them up." The silence in that room became enormous. The clerk looked at this man in the duster and apparently found something in Andrew Alden's expression that Annie had missed, or perhaps she had not missed it at all, but had simply been too angry to catalog it properly. Something that communicated, without any drama or flourish, that the instruction was not a request. The clerk bent down and picked up the papers. That was how it began, not with a tender glance across a prairie, not with a slow-building neighborly familiarity. It began with a patent application on a dusty floor in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, and a man who told a petty bureaucrat to pick up what he had knocked down. But Annie Thatcher had not come to Cheyenne looking for a man to fight her battles. She had come to Cheyenne because of the coal seams. 3 months before that morning in the land office, she had been in Cincinnati, Ohio, watching the walls of her life close in on her from every direction. Her father had died in the spring, leaving behind debts that his pride had never acknowledged, and a house that the bank moved to claim before the funeral flowers had wilted. Her brother Edmund, 2 years her senior and constitutionally unable to see a woman's competence as anything but an affront, had informed her that she was welcome to come and live in his house in Columbus and serve as governess to his 4 children, since she had no husband and apparently no sense. She had no husband. That was true enough. She had been engaged once, to a man named Robert Calloway, who had seemed, for a brief hopeful season, to genuinely appreciate the way her mind worked, right up until the moment she had quietly solved an engineering problem at his father's mill that 3 men with degrees from Ohio State had failed to solve for 6 weeks. and the gratitude on his face had curdled into something she had never been able to name precisely, but that tasted, in her memory, like betrayal. She had packed a single trunk and taken the train west. She had chosen Wyoming territory for specific reasons. The territorial legislature of Wyoming had granted women the right to vote and to serve on juries in 1869, a fact so astonishing that the eastern newspapers had covered it with the same breathless bewilderment they might devote to a two-headed calf. But more practically, Wyoming had coal, and coal had problems, and problems were the architecture Annie Thatcher lived inside. She had read about the mining operations around Carbon County and the hydraulic challenges of the Mountain Creek diversion systems. And by the time the train pulled into Cheyenne, she had 3 ideas already sketched in the small leather notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She had a 4th idea by the time she found her boarding house on Ferguson Street. She had arrived with $53, a trunk full of books and drawing equipment, and a set of ideas so dense and interlocking that they felt, sometimes, like a second skeleton, a framework that held her upright when everything external tried to flatten her. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Clara Potts, who was 60 years old and had buried 2 husbands and a son on this frontier, and had arrived at a philosophy of radical practicality that Annie found immediately comforting. Mrs. Potts did not ask unnecessary questions. She provided a room with a south-facing window, a sturdy table, and an oil lamp with reliable fuel supply, and she charged $4 a month, which was exactly what Annie could afford. "You'll want to know about the people in this town," Mrs. Potts said on Annie's first evening, setting a plate of beans and cornbread on the table with the efficiency of a woman who had fed strangers for 20 years. "The ones who matter and the ones who don't." "Tell me about both," Annie said, because she had found that the people others dismissed were frequently the most useful. Mrs. Potts settled into the chair across the table with the comfortable authority of a woman in her own home. She described the town with the precision of a mapmaker, the land agents and their hidden motives, the mine operators who ran their claims on Carbon County land through a web of proxies, the lawyers who were mostly honest and the one who absolutely was not, the town doctor who was good with bones and bad with fevers. And then she mentioned Andrew Alden. "He runs the surveying operation out on the Copper Creek claim," Mrs. Potts said. "Came here 4 years ago from somewhere in New Mexico territory, though he doesn't talk about that. He's honest in a way that's almost inconvenient around here, because it makes him enemies among the people who aren't. He helped old Jeb Hartley get his water rights documented last summer when the Consolidated Mining Company tried to run a claim through Hartley's Creek diversion. Spent 3 weeks doing it without asking for a cent. That sounds like a man with a dark past trying to compensate for something," Annie said. Mrs. Potts looked at her with eyes that had seen 30 years of human nature on the frontier. "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe some people are just built honest and it costs them accordingly." Annie had noted the name and thought no more about it, because she had work to do. For 2 weeks she moved through Cheyenne like a methodical scientist through an unfamiliar lab, observing, cataloging, mapping the topology of the place. She visited the assay office and studied the mineral survey maps. She rode out to Carbon County with a hired horse and a notebook, and spent 4 days examining the sluice gate systems at 3 different mining operations, asking questions that the mine foreman answered either with suspicious confusion or with the kind of amused condescension that she had learned to absorb and filter into useful information. She visited the machine shop on Cary Avenue run by a taciturn German immigrant named Friedrich Bauer, who looked at her drawings for 20 minutes without speaking, and then said, quietly, that he could fabricate the pivot housing she had designed, but that the tolerance she specified for the valve seat would require a different alloy than they typically stocked, and did she have a preference among 3 options he described. She liked Friedrich Bauer very much. She went back to her room and worked. She worked at the table by lamplight until her back ached and her eyes burned, and the oil in the lamp ran low, and then she trimmed the wick and worked some more. She was building the application for her first patent, the hydraulic sluice gate mechanism that had occupied her thoughts since Cincinnati, and she was building it the way she built everything, which was with the full architecture of her intelligence brought to bear on every detail. She knew the patent system. She had studied it as thoroughly as she had studied hydraulics. A woman could legally file for a patent in the United States, had been able to do so since 1809, when Mary Kies received the first patent granted to an American woman. But knowing the law and navigating the human terrain of the law were two completely different enterprises. She was under no illusions about that. The morning she walked into the Territorial Land Office with her completed application, she had dressed carefully, not to impress, but to armor. Her best dark wool skirt, her traveling jacket with the brass buttons, her hair pinned with an intentional severity that said she was here on business and expected to be treated accordingly. She had reviewed the application 3 more times on her way down Ferguson Street, testing it against every possible objection. She had not prepared for simple, naked contempt. And then Andrew Alden had walked in behind her and told the clerk to pick up the papers. The clerk processed the application. He did it with the sullen efficiency of a man doing something under compulsion, checking each page against the processing form with exaggerated care, looking for any technical deficiency that might give him legitimate grounds for rejection. He found none. Annie had made sure of that. When it was done, she stepped back from the counter and turned to find Andrew Alden leaning against the wall by the door, hat in his hands, watching the proceedings with a patience that seemed entirely natural to him, the patience of a man accustomed to waiting for difficult things to resolve. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without excessive warmth, because she did not want to signal that she had needed rescuing, which she had not. She had needed a catalyst, which was different. "I've been watching Nellie refuse applications for a solid year," Andrew said. His voice was low and unhurried, a voice shaped by years of giving directions in open country where the wind could carry words away. "The territory has a law about it, and he knows the territory has a law about it, and most days nobody's there to remind him of that. You know the territorial processing requirements," Annie said, with genuine curiosity now rather than social courtesy. "I'm a surveyor. Land law is something I need to know in some detail." He put his hat back on. "Andrew Alden, Annie Thatcher." He nodded, and she noticed that he did not follow the nod with any of the usual conversational reflexes. He did not ask what brought her to town, or where she was from, or what a woman was doing filing patent applications, or any of the dozens of questions that would have announced his assumption that her presence required explanation. She found that notable. "I was heading to Friedrich Bauer's shop," she said, gathering her copy of the application into her portfolio. "I have some fabrication specifications to review." "I know Friedrich," Andrew said. "Good man." They walked out of the land office into the October sunlight together, not quite beside each other, not quite apart. The street outside was all dust and commerce, and the distant clatter of wagon wheels on rutted ground. Annie paused on the boardwalk and looked at the Laramie Range on the western horizon, still carrying snow at the peaks at this time of year, brilliant white against the cold blue sky, and felt, as she sometimes did in moments of accomplished work, a small, fierce joy. "What's the application for?" Andrew asked. He was not being impertinent. She could hear in the question the genuine curiosity of someone who dealt in practical mechanisms. "A hydraulic sluice gate system," she said, "single-lever operation, for small mining claims with limited manpower." He turned to look at her directly, and she saw it then, the same thing she had seen in Friedrich Bauer's expression, the same careful attention that a person gives when they encounter something that is actually, genuinely interesting rather than merely novel. "How does the pivot housing work?" he asked. She told him. She told him standing on the boardwalk in the October light, using her hands to illustrate the geometry, watching him follow the explanation with focused intelligence. And before she had finished, she was aware of something shifting in the way the conversation felt, a kind of mutual recognizing that was rarer than gold in her experience and considerably more valuable. They walked to Friedrich Bauer's shop together, and they talked about hydraulics all the way. Andrew Alden's surveying operation was small but established himself and two assistants, a half-Sioux man named Jonas Crow, who had a gift for reading terrain that Andrew described as something between science and the closest thing to actual magic that Andrew personally believed in, and a young man from Kansas named Billy Pratt, who was 19 years old, deeply earnest, and had been following Andrew around the territory for 2 years in the way that certain young men follow certain older men when they find in them a model of how to be in the world. Andrew's work took him across Carbon County and into the adjacent territories, mapping claims and resolving boundary disputes, and documenting water rights with a precision that had built him a solid reputation among the people who valued precision, and a corresponding degree of hostility from the people who preferred the boundary disputes to remain unresolved in ways that happened to favor them. He had an office on 18th Street that was less an office than a drafting room, a large table covered with survey maps, a shelf of transit cases and measuring equipment, a potbelly stove that he kept burning from September through April, and a smell of paper and pencil lead and cold air that Annie, when she first visited it 2 weeks after their meeting at the land office, found as comforting as a library. She had come because she needed someone who knew water rights law with specificity, and Mrs. Potts had mentioned him, and after their conversation at Friedrich Bauer's shop, she had decided he was someone whose professional opinion she could trust. She had not come because she was drawn to him. She told herself that very firmly, several times on the walk from Ferguson Street to 18th Street. The attraction was inconvenient. That was the only honest description for it. She had arrived in Wyoming territory with a Mission 3 patents, a plan, and no room in any of it for the complication of feeling. She had been hurt before, in the specific way that a thinking woman gets hurt when a man encounters her intelligence and treats it as a threat. She carried that hurt the way she carried everything difficult, turned into fuel, burned for light. But Andrew Alden had not, in their first encounter or their second, shown the slightest sign of treating her intelligence as a threat. He had treated it as a fact, the way he treated the elevation of a slope or the flow rate of a creek, as a piece of information to work with rather than a problem to solve. This was so unusual that it made her alert to it in the way you become alert to things that might be too good to be what they appear. She was watching for the hidden motive. She always was. She knocked on the frame of the open door of his office on a Thursday afternoon in late October with 2 notebooks under her arm and a question about creek diversion rights under the Territorial Water Code of 1875. Andrew was at the drafting table with a transit scope partially disassembled in front of him and a lens cloth in his hand. He looked up. He was not startled. She had the impression he was rarely startled, and he said, "Annie Thatcher, come in." "I need your opinion on something," she said, "professionally speaking." "Sit down," he said, and went back to cleaning the lens with the careful attention of someone who understood that precise instruments require precise care. "Tell me." She sat down across the drafting table and opened her notebook and began to explain the second idea, the one that had been forming since her visit to the Carbon County claims, the one that was not about sluice gates at all, but about water rights documentation and the systematic inefficiency of the current claim staking process, which required physical stakes at each corner of a claim in conditions that made consistent placement nearly impossible, leading to overlapping claims and disputes that could persist for years. Her idea was for a reference grid system, a set of permanently mounted survey markers at calculated intervals across the county, each one numbered and cataloged, from which any claim could be precisely described in terms of distance and bearing, rather than physical stakes that could be moved, damaged, or disputed. The patents would cover the design of the marker hardware, a specific cast iron ground anchor with a standardized reference face, and the documentation methodology. Andrew set down the lens cloth and listened to all of it without interruption, which was another thing she noticed about him, that he listened the way he surveyed, with full attention and without the need to insert himself into the middle of the information. "That would put a lot of claim lawyers out of business," he said when she finished. "That is perhaps the second best thing about it," Annie said. He looked at her across the drafting table, and something in the look was warm in a way that was distinct from professional approval, and she felt it in the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm, not dramatically, but with a certainty that something in the atmosphere had shifted. "The markers will need to survive freeze-thaw cycles in mountain terrain," he said. "The anchor has to go below the frost line or you'll get heave." "I know," she said. "I'm designing the anchor plate for a 30-inch depth minimum with a lateral flange spread of 8 inches on each side," he said. She looked at him. "It's what the soil dynamics in this county require," he said. "Yes," she said, and she felt the smile arrive on her face before she had given it permission. "Exactly that." They worked at his drafting table for 3 hours. It was the kind of working together that Annie had experienced precisely twice in her life, and had concluded was vanishingly rare, where two minds engaged with a problem found, instead of competition, a kind of complementary rhythm, one person's knowledge fitting into the gaps of the other's the way a key fits a lock. Andrew knew the field conditions. Annie knew the mechanical and documentation systems. The result of 3 hours was a substantially better second patent application than the one she had arrived with. Outside, the sky went dark early the way it does in the Wyoming autumn, and the temperature dropped with the specific efficiency of mountain air, and neither of them had noticed the transition. "There's a pie at the hotel restaurant," Andrew said, in the tone of a man making a factual statement rather than an invitation. "It's not what you call remarkable, but it's hot." "I haven't eaten since this morning," Annie said. They ate pie at the hotel restaurant and talked about everything except anything personal. They talked about the survey maps of Carbon County and the geological implications of certain drainage patterns and the specific failure modes of timber flume construction in high-altitude environments. They drank coffee that was considerably better than the pie. She walked back to Mrs. Potts' boarding house alone in the cold night air, under a sky so full of stars that it seemed almost threatening in its excess, and she allowed herself precisely one block of honest acknowledgement before she put it away. She was in trouble with Andrew Alden, and she had known she was going to be since the moment he had told the clerk to pick up the papers, not because he had rescued her, but because of the specific, precise way he had understood exactly what needed doing and had done it without drama or self-congratulation, and that quality, that economy of right action, was the most dangerous thing she had ever encountered. She put it away and went to bed and worked on her third patent idea until the lamp oil ran out. November arrived with a violence that Mrs. Potts described as early but not historically unusual. The Laramie Range buried itself in cloud and the temperature in Cheyenne dropped to 15 degrees in the first week, and the streets went from dust to frozen mud overnight, and the coal stoves in every building in the territory became the center of human civilization in a very direct and non-metaphorical way. Annie worked. She worked on the Sluice Gate patent application and waited for the processing confirmation from Washington, which could take months. She worked on the reference grid patent with Friedrich Bauer, who was fabricating a prototype anchor from her specifications. And she worked on the third idea, which was the one that she was most uncertain about and therefore most committed to. The third idea had come from watching the mine operation at Copper Creek, specifically from watching the ore cart system on the inclined rail, which used a counterweight mechanism that required 2 men to operate safely, and which, by her calculations, lost approximately 12% of its potential load capacity to the mechanical inefficiency of the current drum brake design. Her proposed solution was a ratchetan pawl braking mechanism that could be operated by a single person and would allow the cart to be loaded to full theoretical capacity without the risk of runaway descent. It was the most mechanically complex of the three ideas. It was also the one with the most direct economic implication for the mine operators, which meant it was the one most likely to attract the hostile attention of the Consolidated Mining Company, which held the major claims in Carbon County and had demonstrated, in the Hartley water rights dispute that Mrs. Potts had described, a pronounced preference for the territory remaining organized in ways that benefited the Consolidated Mining Company specifically. She had been careful not to show the third idea to anyone. Not yet. She was watching the terrain. Andrew came to the boarding house on a Sunday afternoon in the second week of November, which was the first time he had come to her directly rather than her going to him, and he knocked on the door with the formal precision of a man who was aware of the etiquette of the situation and was navigating it deliberately. Mrs. Potts answered the door and showed him into the front parlor with the expression of a woman who was exercising considerable restraint about not saying anything. Annie came downstairs to find him standing by the parlor window with his hat in his hands and a folder of papers under his arm, and the particular quality of the light on his face at that moment. The thin gray November light through the frost-edged glass caught her off guard in a way she was not prepared for. He looked tired. Not the ordinary tired of work, but the other kind, the deeper depletion that comes from carrying something that you don't put down. "I have a problem," he said. "Tell me," she said. He laid the papers on Mrs. Potts' parlor table and showed her survey maps of the eastern section of Carbon County, with annotations in his precise draftsman's hand, showing the boundary of a claim held by a family named Henderson, a husband and wife who had been working a moderate coal seam on their land for 3 years with a small crew, and overlapping it, the expanded claim being filed by the Consolidated Mining Company through a proxy corporation called Territorial Resources, Incorporated. The consolidated claim overlaps Henderson's eastern boundary by 400 yards, Andrew said. They're claiming the original Henderson stakes were incorrectly placed, which would void the original patent. I surveyed Henderson's claim 2 years ago. The stakes were correct. Do you have the original survey documentation? Yes, but Consolidated has a lawyer named Marsh who has filed a counter-documentation arguing that my survey used a non-standard meridian reference. Annie looked at the maps. She looked at the technical specification in the counterfiling. She read it carefully twice, the way she read anything that was trying to fool her. The meridian reference he's citing didn't apply to Carbon County claims filed under the 1875 code, she said. The county was specifically accepted in the supplementary ruling of the same year because of the altitude variance in the magnetic declination readings. Andrew looked at her. How do you know that? I read the Territorial Water Rights Code for my second patent application, and I read everything that was cross-referenced in it, she said. The surveying standards are cross-referenced in Section 14. The expression on his face was not gratitude in the performative sense. It was something quieter than that and considerably more affecting the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight alone and suddenly finds that the load has been understood and shared without any requirement to explain the weight's significance. If that's in the record, he said carefully, then Marsh's counterfiling has no legal foundation. It has no legal foundation, Annie confirmed. But you need someone to put that argument in front of the territorial court, and you need to do it before Henderson's claim is suspended pending the dispute resolution, because a suspension will stop their winter coal extraction, and they cannot afford that. I know, Andrew said. They worked together for 4 hours at Mrs. Potts' parlor table, building the counterargument for Henderson's defense. Annie drafted the legal brief language, and Andrew provided the technical survey specifications, and Mrs. Potts brought them tea and cornbread and did not say anything at all except, at one point, with the serenity of a woman making a casual observation. It's a useful thing when a person finds someone who thinks the way they think. Neither Annie nor Andrew responded to this. Both of them heard it. The Henderson case went before the Territorial Court of Carbon County 3 weeks later. Andrew testified about the survey methodology. Annie had prepared the full counterargument brief, which the Henderson attorney, a young lawyer named Sam Pierce, who Annie had identified as one of the honest ones, delivered with a precision that left Marsh's counterfiling without a single foothold. The judge ruled in Henderson's favor in 4 days. Consolidated Mining's response was immediate and unsurprising. Within a week, someone had filed a complaint with the Territorial Patent Office in Cheyenne, alleging that Annie's first patent application contained fraudulent specifications, that the hydraulic mechanism described could not function as claimed. Annie found out about the complaint from Friedrich Bauer, who had heard it from a man at the assay office who had heard it from the Consolidated Mining Company's local operations manager, whose name was Gerard Walsh, and whose particular combination of intelligence and ruthlessness Mrs. Potts had warned her about in their very first conversation. The trap was clear enough. If the patent was flagged for fraud review, it would be suspended for investigation, potentially for months. The second application would follow. If Annie could be discredited as an inventor, the grid system patent would lose its legal standing. And if she could be discredited as a reliable technical expert, it would undermine Andrew's survey methodology documentation by association. It was elegant, she thought, in the specific way that a mechanism is elegant when it uses the minimum of moving parts to achieve the maximum of destructive effect. Gerard Walsh was not stupid. That was the problem with Gerard Walsh. She sat at her table in her room at Mrs. Potts' boarding house and felt, for the first time since she had arrived in Wyoming territory, the weight of the forces arranged against her. Not panic. She did not panic. It was not a register she operated in, but a clear-eyed assessment of the exposure. She was alone. She had arrived in this territory with $53 and 3 ideas and no allies except a German machinist, an honest young lawyer, and a surveyor she had known for 6 weeks who made her heart behave in ways she had not authorized. That was when she went to Andrew. She walked to his office on 18th Street in the dark of a November evening, with snow just beginning to fall and the thin, dry flakes that Wyoming produces. Not the heavy contemplative snow of the East, but a sharp, business-like precipitation that seemed appropriate to the territory. She knocked on his door and he opened it and looked at her face and moved aside to let her in without a word, the way you let someone in from a storm. She told him about the complaint. She told him about Walsh and what she thought Walsh's objective was, and why the timing was connected to the Henderson case. Andrew listened to all of it standing by the potbelly stove with his arms folded, and a stillness about him that she had come to recognize was not detachment, but rather the opposite, the quality of attention that becomes still when it is fully engaged. "There's something you don't know," he said when she finished, "about me and Walsh." This was the moment she had been waiting for. The hidden motive, the dark past, the thing that explained the edges she had felt around him, the territories he did not enter in conversation, the locked rooms behind his eyes. "Tell me," she said. He told her. 4 years ago, in New Mexico territory, Andrew Alden had been the lead surveyor on a massive land grant claim that the Consolidated Mining Company, operating under a different subsidiary name in New Mexico, but the same corporation, had filed against a community of ranching families, some of them Hispanic families who had held that land under Spanish and Mexican grants for generations. The survey had been, to put it plainly, falsified. Not by Andrew. He had documented the existing boundaries accurately and completely, but the documentation had been altered after his submission, his name kept on it as the certifying surveyor, and the claim had been used to dispossess 11 families from land they had held for 2 generations. By the time Andrew discovered what had been done to his documentation, the families had already lost their appeal. There was nothing he could do to restore their land. though he had taken the falsification evidence to 3 different federal courts before a senior consolidated attorney had delivered a message that was not quite a threat and not quite a promise, but that made the stakes of continuing entirely clear. He had come to Wyoming territory because it was far enough from New Mexico that he could work without Consolidated's direct interference, and because the territory had different subsidiary operations, and because he had told himself he was just trying to build an honest career somewhere new. "But Walsh knows who I am," Andrew said. "He knows my name from the New Mexico documentation." He was the operations manager in New Mexico at the time. The silence in the room was full of something complex, the specific weight of a secret that has been carried for a long time and finally set down. "Then the fraud complaint against my patent isn't just about discrediting me," Annie said slowly. "It's about getting to you." "I think so. They want to tie your name to another falsified documentation claim, this time with a patent rather than a land grant. If they can establish a pattern of fraudulent technical documentation involving my name, the New Mexico evidence I've collected becomes inadmissible." Annie stood very still in the drafting room of Andrew Alden's office, with the snow hissing against the windows and the stove radiating in the corner, and she thought about betrayal and about the specific architecture of corruption that uses honest people's honest work as the scaffolding for dishonest ends, and she felt a fury that was not hot and uncontrolled but cold and very precise, the kind of fury that is most useful. "Do you have the original New Mexico survey documentation?" she asked. "The unaltered version?" "Yes," Andrew said, "in a bank lock box in Denver." "The fraud complaint against my patent," Annie said, "will be investigated by the Territorial Land Office. The investigation will require a technical review of the mechanism specifications." "I know. Friedrich Bauer has already fabricated a prototype based on my specifications. It works exactly as specified because my specifications are accurate. The fraud complaint will fail the technical review. But by the time the review is completed, 3 months, possibly 4, she nodded, long enough for Walsh to do whatever he's planning to do in the interim. "Annie." Andrew said her name in a particular way, not urgently, not dramatically, but with a weight that made her look at him directly, which was something she had been careful not to do too directly since that evening at the hotel restaurant, because it was harder than she let herself acknowledge. "This is my problem, not yours. What Walsh is trying to do to your patents is collateral to what he's trying to do to me. I won't let you." "You will not tell me what you will and will not let me do," she said, and the steadiness in her own voice surprised her, not the anger in it, which was real, but the other thing underneath the anger, the fierce personal investment that she had told herself she was not feeling. "You don't have that authority." He looked at her for a long moment, and she saw in his face the recognition of something, the same mutual recognizing she had felt at the drafting table, but more nakedly expressed now, without the comfortable cover of a technical discussion. "No," he said quietly, "I don't." "Then let me help you," she said, "the way you helped me at the land office." "That was nothing," he said. "It was a catalyst," she said, "and that's everything." The third patent application was filed on the 4th of December, 1878, on a morning when the temperature in Cheyenne was 4 degrees above zero, and the sky was the particular hard bright blue of midwinter in the high country. Annie wore her heavy wool coat and her warmest gloves and walked to the Territorial Land Office with Andrew Alden beside her, their breath making parallel clouds in the frozen air. Nellie the clerk was behind the counter. He looked up and saw them both and performed a brief internal calculation that resulted, apparently, in the decision that processing the application without incident was the most sensible available option. The third application was for the ratchetan pawl or cart brake mechanism. It was Annie's most complex and most carefully constructed application, and Nellie processed it without a word. Outside on the boardwalk, Annie looked at the sky, that impossibly bright winter sky over the Laramie Range, and felt the specific satisfaction of having done what she had set out to do. 3 patents, October, November, December. One season. She had been told this territory was no place for a woman with ideas. She had filed 3 patents before winter was fully upon them. 3, Andrew said beside her. 3, she confirmed. He was looking at her, and she was looking at the mountains, and she was aware of his gaze with every nerve she possessed, and she was also aware that she was at a threshold of some kind, standing at the edge of something she had been approaching since October, and that the approach had been inexorable not because she had willed it, but because it had the logic of physical law, the logic of water finding the lowest point in the terrain. She turned and looked at him. "Andrew," she said. "Annie," he said. "I am not a woman who does things in half measures," she said. "I need you to understand that before this, whatever this is, goes any further." "I understand it," he said. "It's one of the things He stopped. He was not, she had learned, a man given to speeches. He lived inside his words the way he lived inside his work, precisely, without decoration, with the care that comes from knowing that words, like survey measurements, matter. It's one of the things," he said simply. She would think about that later, that particular sentence with its deliberate incompletion, and what lived in the space where it ended. She would think about it that evening and the next morning and the one after that, while simultaneously working on the technical response to Walsh's fraud complaint and the preparation of a legal brief for Sam Pierce to file with the Federal Circuit Court, incorporating Andrew's New Mexico documentation. Because that was the strategy she had arrived at. The best defense against Walsh's attack was not to wait for it to play out, but to bring the New Mexico falsification into the federal record before Walsh had time to use the patent fraud complaint to establish a counter-narrative. If Andrew's original, unaltered New Mexico survey documentation could be entered as evidence in a federal proceeding, it would establish both his credibility and the existence of a pattern of document falsification by Consolidated Mining Company subsidiaries. Getting the documentation from Denver required Andrew to make the trip himself, 3 days by train in December, through mountain passes that were not reliably open in winter. It required Sam Pierce to file the federal brief on a timeline that gave Walsh no opportunity to preempt it. And it required Friedrich Bauer to make his prototype available for the technical review of the patent fraud complaint, which required Friedrich to close his shop for 2 days during peak winter demand, which was a significant sacrifice. Friedrich Bauer agreed immediately and without complaint. Jonas Crow, Andrew's half-sous assistant, offered to ride out to the Henderson claim and ensure that Walsh's operations hadn't crossed the eastern boundary in Andrew's absence. A real risk, given that the legal victory had apparently only sharpened Walsh's intentions rather than deterring them. Jonas was quiet about the offer in the way he was quiet about most things, but the offer was made and accepted, and Annie watched Andrew's expression when Jonas made it and understood something further about the texture of the life Andrew had built here. That it was a genuine thing, made of genuine connections, not just a strategic retreat from what had happened in New Mexico. On the evening before Andrew left for Denver, he came to Mrs. Potts' boarding house. Mrs. Potts showed him into the parlor and then discovered pressing business in the kitchen, which Annie privately appreciated. Andrew sat across from her in the parlor, and for a while neither of them spoke, which was a quality of their companionship that she had noticed from the beginning. They were comfortable in silence in the way that people are only comfortable when they have stopped performing for each other. "Tell me what you're not telling me," Annie said eventually. Andrew looked at her steadily. "I have thought about you every day since we walked from the land office to Friedrich's shop," he said. "I have thought about you so specifically, and so often that it has interfered with my surveying. And I am a man who does not allow things to interfere with my surveying." She felt the warmth move through her chest like a physical thing. "I have told myself several times that I was wrong about what I was feeling," he continued, "because I have been wrong before about people, about situations, and the cost of being wrong about a thing like this seems very high to me." "What changed your mind?" she asked. "About being wrong?" "The moment in the land office," he said. "I walked in and saw those papers on the floor, and I saw your face, and I knew, not what you felt, I didn't presume to know that, but I knew what kind of person you were. The kind who has been knocked down by something smaller than they are, and has not been diminished by it." And that was, he stopped again with that same deliberate stop. "That was something I recognized," he said. She understood this. She understood it in a way that went beyond the words, that he was describing not just admiration but recognition, the recognition of someone who had also been knocked down by things smaller than themselves and had refused the diminishment. "I am afraid," she said honestly. "I have been afraid of this since October. Not of you," she added, wanting that to be clear. "Of myself, of how much this matters. It matters the same amount on this side of the table," he said. She reached across and put her hand over his, and he turned his hand over and held hers with a carefulness that she felt in every part of her, and they sat in Mrs. Potts' parlor in the lamplight with the winter pressing against the windows, and it was, she thought, the most honest moment she had experienced in years. Andrew left for Denver the next morning on the 6 o'clock train. Annie watched the train go from the platform with her coat buttoned against the cold and a very specific feeling of suspended waiting, the kind that comes when the mechanism has been set in motion and the outcome is not yet determined, but the direction is clear, and all that remains is to see whether the engineering holds. The days he was gone were full. Walsh filed an additional complaint, this one with the territorial governor's office, alleging that the reference grid system described in Annie's second patent application constituted an unauthorized imposition on public land management, which was legally creative in a way Annie could only admire in theory while fighting it in practice. She drafted the response herself and delivered it to Sam Pierce's office with a cover note explaining the specific statutory sections that refuted it. Sam Pierce, reading the response, looked up from his desk and said, "Miss Thatcher, have you considered the bar examination?" "I considered it and was told women could not sit for it," she said. "In most states," he said. "Wyoming territory has not specifically prohibited it." She filed that away. Jonah's Crow came back from the Henderson claim with a report that Walsh's crew had begun marking survey stakes 400 yards east of the adjudicated boundary line, not yet crossing it, but making their intention visible. Jonah's had photographed the stakes with Andrew's survey camera, a bulky and complex instrument that Jonah's operated with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to everything, and the photographs were added to Sam Pierce's evidence file. Friedrich Bauer completed the prototype demonstration for the patent fraud review. The mechanism worked exactly as Annie's specifications described. The technical reviewer, a man sent from the Territorial Patent Office in Cheyenne, who had the air of someone expecting to find an error, and found instead a competent and functional device, produced a report that Annie reviewed before it was filed and found technically accurate in every particular. The fraud complaint would not survive it. Andrew came back from Denver on a Wednesday afternoon, stepping off the train into a snowstorm that had moved in from the west overnight, the kind of serious Wyoming winter storm that was not dramatic in its announcement but was entirely serious in its execution. He came directly from the platform to the boarding house, because that was where he had told her he would come, and Mrs. Potts let him in and called up the stairs, and Annie came down, and there was a moment in the hallway when they stood close enough that she could smell the cold of the journey still on his coat, and she was aware, not for the first time but more acutely than before, of the specific gravity between them. "I have the documentation," he said, "the originals and the notarized copies. Sam Pierce can file by end of week." "The patent fraud review has been resolved," she said. "The technical reviewer's report clears the first application." Something in his face relaxed, very slightly, the fractional release of tension that in a less restrained man would have been a visible exhale. "Good," he said. "Come sit down," she said. "You look like you need coffee and food in that order." Mrs. Potts, from somewhere in the direction of the kitchen, said she happened to have both. They sat at the parlor table with coffee and a plate of Mrs. Potts' cornbread, and Andrew described the Denver trip, the bank, the lock box, the long afternoon of reviewing documents he had not looked at in 4 years, the process of opening a door back into the darkest chapter of his professional life, and walking through it for the purpose of making it useful rather than just painful. "The families in New Mexico," Annie said carefully. "The ones who lost their land. Most of them are still there," he said. "Working as laborers on land that was their grandfather's. 2 of the families went to California." He stopped. "There's nothing I can do to give them back what was taken." "But you can establish that it was taken fraudulently," she said. "And you can establish who is responsible. That's not nothing. It's not enough." "No," she said, "it's not enough. But it's honest and it's real and it's what can be done." She looked at him directly. "You came here to build something honest. You have. And now you're using it." He looked at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between gratitude and grief, and the specific tenderness of a person who has been understood more completely than they expected. "Annie," he said. "Yes," she said, not entirely certain what she was answering, but certain that whatever it was, the answer was yes. He reached across the table and touched her face, very briefly and very gently, with the back of his hand, and it was the most understated declaration she had ever received, and the one that reached her most deeply. Sam Pierce filed the federal brief on the 15th of December, incorporating Andrew's New Mexico survey documentation, the photographic evidence of Walsh's new boundary stakes at the Henderson claim, and a comprehensive account of Consolidated Mining Company's pattern of documentation falsification across both New Mexico and Wyoming Territory operations. It was filed with the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals in Denver, which had federal jurisdiction over the territorial courts. Walsh's response was immediate. He sent a man to Andrew's office on 18th Street with a letter that read, in its most direct passage, that Mr. Alden and his associates would be well served to consider whether the professional and personal difficulties they currently faced were worth the continuation of a course of action that could be amicably resolved. Andrew read the letter and put it directly in Sam Pierce's evidence file as an attempted intimidation of a federal witness. Annie read it over Andrew's shoulder and felt a clean, hard satisfaction that she recognized as the feeling she got when a mechanism performed exactly as the engineering predicted. "He's frightened," she said. "He should be," Andrew said. The 8th Circuit acknowledged the brief the following week. The federal investigation of Consolidated Mining Company's documentation practices in both territories was formally opened in January of 1879. Walsh departed Cheyenne on the 27th of December, ostensibly for the company's headquarters in Chicago, and was not seen in Wyoming Territory again. The Henderson claim was officially secured. Friedrich Bauer received a commendation from the Territorial Patent Office for his cooperation with the technical review. Jonas Crow went back to his regular work of reading terrain with the equanimity of a man who had not been surprised by any of this. And Annie Thatcher received on the 23rd of December, 1878, by territorial post, the official notification of approval for her first patent, United States Patent Number 210,847, for an improved hydraulic sluice gate mechanism with single-lever operation, invented by Annie Thatcher of Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory. She sat at the table in her room at Mrs. Potts' boarding house and held the notification in her hands for a long time, in the particular silence of a person receiving evidence of something they have worked for and believed in but not dared to fully count on until this moment. Then she put on her coat and walked to 18th Street. Andrew opened the door before she knocked, as though he had been expecting her, or perhaps as though some quality of the approaching footstep was recognizable to him now. She showed him the notification. He read it. Then he looked at her face with an expression of genuine and unguarded joy, not performed, not proportioned to what was socially appropriate, but real and bright and fully present in a way that she found more affecting than any declaration he could have made. "Annie," he said. She kissed him. It was the first time, and she did it the way she did everything, with complete intention, and without apology. And after a fractional moment of surprised stillness, he kissed her back with a warmth that she felt down to her bones. And it was nothing like the careful, tentative thing she had expected, but something more certain, more already known, as though they were not beginning something, but arriving at something that had already been true for a while. They stood in the doorway of his drafting room on 18th Street in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory, in the winter of 1878, and Mrs. Potts was nowhere nearby to make calm observations, and the snow was falling outside with its thin, businesslike Wyoming efficiency. And Annie Thatcher had her first patent, and she was kissing Andrew Alden, and the world was arranged in a way that seemed, for this specific moment, entirely logical. The winter of 1878 moved into the spring of 1879, the way Wyoming winters do, not with the gentle retreat of eastern seasons, but with a grudging, contested withdrawal, cold holding on past what any reasonable meteorology would allow, and then surrendering all at once into a May of extraordinary green, the high prairie coming alive in a rush of color that seemed improbable after the monochrome severity of the preceding months. The second patent approval arrived in February, the reference grid system, patent number 213,422. The third arrived in March, patent number 215,089, for the ore cart brake mechanism. 3 patents, 1 season, as she had promised herself. The Carbon County mine operators began inquiring about licensing the sluice gate mechanism almost immediately after the first approval was published. Annie conducted those negotiations herself, with Sam Pierce reviewing the contracts, and the first licensing agreement was signed in April with a Carbon County operation called Blue Sky Mining that ran 3 claims on the eastern face of Medicine Bow Peak. The terms were fair. Annie had no interest in predatory licensing, which she considered as ethically bankrupt as any other form of extraction, but they were sufficient, and the income they generated was transformative in a material sense that she allowed herself to feel proud of. She moved out of Mrs. Potts' boarding house. She took a proper lease on a small building on Warren Avenue that had the right dimensions for both a working office and living quarters, a main room with enough wall space for a proper drafting table, 2 south-facing windows for light, a sleeping room, and a kitchen that was adequate for someone who cooked with the same empirical approach she brought to everything else. She bought a good lamp and a better drafting table and installed a proper stove. Mrs. Potts came to see the new place on the day Annie moved in, walked through every room with the expert eye of a woman who had evaluated many living situations over 60 years, and announced that it would do admirably, and that she hoped Annie understood that the offer of Sunday dinner remained standing regardless of present address. "I understand," Annie said, and hugged Mrs. Potts, who submitted to this with the gruff acceptance of a woman who considered demonstrations of affection a tolerable occasional inconvenience. Andrew came on the second evening, when the moving was done and the drafting table was positioned, and the lamp was lit, and Annie was standing in the middle of her own space, genuinely her own, paid for by her own work, with a feeling she could only describe as complete. He brought a bottle of something that Friedrich Bauer had given him, which was Friedrich's home-produced schnapps, which was considerably better than it had any right to be. They drank it at Annie's new drafting table with the plans for the second-generation sluice gate spread between them, because even in the midst of celebration she was already thinking about the next version, the improved design, the problem she had not yet solved. "Are you always working?" he asked, with the warmth of someone who finds this particular quality charming rather than exhausting. "I am always thinking," she said. "Working is just what thinking looks like from outside." He refilled both glasses and leaned back in his chair and looked at her with the steady, full-presence attention that she had never quite gotten used to, even after months of it, that quality of being genuinely, completely seen. "I want to ask you something," he said. She felt the quality of the question before he asked it, something in the deliberateness of his tone, the care. "Then ask," she said. "I am aware," he said, "that you came here alone and built this alone, and that the independence you have is something you earned in circumstances that made it necessary, and that you value it in a way that is completely reasonable. I am also aware that I have no right to ask you to fold that independence into something that might compromise it, and that the question I want to ask has historically been a mechanism by which women's independence is compromised." She looked at him. He was so earnest about this, so genuinely careful, that she felt it as a physical tenderness. "Andrew," she said, "I want to ask you to marry me," he said. "Not because the territory expects it, or because it would be proper, or because I think you need anything I have. I want to ask you because I have been happier in the last 8 months than I have been in my adult life, and because the specific happiness comes from you and who you are and how your mind works, and because the thought of going home to my house on nights when I don't see you is a thought I have found increasingly difficult." "Yes," she said. He blinked. "That was quick. Yes, I know." She set down her glass. "I have been thinking about it for 3 months, and I arrived at yes in November, and have simply been waiting for you to ask." The expression that moved across his face was pure, unguarded joy, the same thing she had seen when she showed him the first patent approval, but larger and warmer and more completely filled with the specific quality of a person who has been carrying a hope they were afraid to acknowledge and has just received permission to set it down. He came around the drafting table and she stood, and he held her with a gentleness that was not timidity but care, the care of someone who holds things that matter very precisely. And she put her arms around him and felt the warmth of him and the realness of him, and she thought, "This is the architecture of home, and it is the most complicated and the most simple thing I have ever built." They were married in June of 1879 in the parlor of Mrs. Potts' boarding house, because the boarding house was, in some essential sense, where it had begun, and Mrs. Potts agreed with the efficiency of a woman for whom the answer was always yes when the question was right. Sam Pierce served as a witness. Friedrich Bauer came with his wife, a small, fierce German woman named Greta, who embraced Annie with the authority of someone who had decided to love her immediately and completely. Jonas Crow stood at the back of the room and said nothing, which was Jonas Crow's complete participation in an event, and which, from Jonas, felt like the fullest possible expression of approval. The ceremony was conducted by the town's Presbyterian minister, who was named Reverend Ellis, and who had known Andrew for 3 years and had, by Annie's estimation, already decided several months earlier that this was where things were heading and was simply waiting for the paperwork. Mrs. Potts provided a wedding cake that was, in her own words, not what you'd call remarkable, but was warm and sweet and real, and which tasted to Annie like the specific sweetness of a life built exactly the way she had wanted to build it. Andrew had moved his surveying operation into the building next to Annie's office on Warren Avenue by that point. It made practical sense, and practical sense was something they both understood as the skeleton that supported every other kind of sense. The shared wall between the 2 offices had a door cut into it, which they had done themselves one Saturday afternoon in May with a handsaw and the cheerful companionship of 2 people engaged in a project together, and the door between their offices was almost always open. The federal investigation of Consolidated Mining Company proceeded through 1879 into 1880 with the methodical pace of federal proceedings. It was not fast, it was not dramatic, but it was thorough, and it was real, and by the spring of 1880 it had produced a series of formal findings that included the identification of the specific individuals responsible for the New Mexico survey document falsification, the official invalidation of the fraudulent claim that had dispossessed the 11 ranching families, and a referral to the Department of Justice for criminal charges against 3 company officers. The land in New Mexico was not returned. That was the hard truth of it. the legal mechanisms for restoring property from a company that had already subdivided and sold the claim did not exist in a form that could move fast enough to matter to the families who had already rebuilt their lives elsewhere. Andrew knew this and carried it, and Annie did not try to take it from him, because it was his to carry, and the carrying of it was part of what made him who he was. But the record was corrected. The false documentation was expunged. Andrew Alden's professional certification was formally cleared of the falsification that had been attached to his name without his knowledge or consent, and the official survey records of Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, were amended to reflect his actual methodology in its verified accuracy. He came home on the evening the clearing notification arrived home, which was the Warren Avenue building that was now entirely their shared home. The two offices and the living quarters all woven together in the way that two people's lives weave together when they are genuinely aligned. And he sat in the kitchen for a long time with the notification in front of him and did not speak. And Annie sat across from him and did not speak either, and the silence was the right kind. Eventually he looked up, and his expression had the quality of a man who has set down a weight he had been carrying for so long he had forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she confirmed. He reached across the kitchen table and took her hand and held it in the way he held things that mattered, with the care and the precision and the specific warmth of someone who knows the value of what they're holding. By the fall of 1880, Annie had filed a fourth patent application, a refined version of the reference grid anchor, designed for use in high-alkali soil conditions in the southern part of the territory, which addressed a specific field challenge that had emerged from the implementation of the original grid system across Carbon County. The implementation had been contracted through the Territorial Land Survey Office, and it was now in active use as the standard methodology for new claim documentation across 3 Wyoming counties. She was also, as of September of that year, pregnant, and this was a fact she had known for 6 weeks, and had spent the 6 weeks integrating with the same methodical attention she brought to any new variable in an active system. She told Andrew on a Sunday evening when they were sitting in the kitchen after dinner, the last of the summer light still fading outside the window, and she told him simply and directly because that was how she told him everything. He absorbed it the way he absorbed important information in stillness, fully, before speaking. Then he looked at her with an expression that was not simply joy, though joy was present, but something larger, a compound of wonder and seriousness, and the specific kind of love that deepens rather than performs. "Are you?" he started. "I am well," she said. "I am calculating the adjustments to the work schedule with some interest. The fourth patent application is filed. The Carbon County grid contract has a project manager now who knows the methodology, and Friedrich Bauer can handle the fabrication oversight for the next 6 months without me. So the timing is—" "Annie," he said. She stopped. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him. This man she had found in a territorial land office over 2 years ago, standing behind her with a precise understanding of what needed to be done, who had walked with her through fraud complaints and federal investigations and the specific cold of Wyoming winters, who knew her work the way she knew it, and who held her hand with the care of someone who understands value. And she felt the happiness as a physical fact, as structural as the frame of a building, as reliable as the mathematics she had trusted her whole life. "Yes," she said, "entirely." Their son was born in the spring of 1881, the 14th of April, which was a Friday, and which Mrs. Potts declared was a good day for a person to arrive in the world, because Friday was the end of the work week, and a person born on Friday would always know how to recognize when a job was done. They named him Thomas Edwin Alden. Thomas for no particular historical reason except that it sounded solid, and Edwin for Andrew's father, who had been, by Andrew's account, a man of ordinary virtues and extraordinary patience. Thomas Edwin was a dark-eyed, opinionated infant who arrived with the full force of personality and spent his first year making his preferences entirely clear on all subjects, which Annie found amusing and Andrew found deeply relatable in a way he did not entirely explain. Mrs. Potts visited every Sunday and held the baby with the practiced efficiency of a woman who had held many babies and knew that they required less delicacy than they were usually given. And Thomas Edwin appeared to agree with this assessment and was always calmer in Mrs. Potts' arms than in anyone else's, which Mrs. Potts accepted with the serenity of a woman who did not find this surprising. Friedrich Bauer's wife Greta made a quilt. Jonah's crow carved a small wooden horse with a perfection of detail that was, like everything Jonah's crow did, inexplicably better than expected. The year Thomas Edwin was born was also the year Annie's fourth patent was approved, and the year she gave the first of what would become a series of technical presentations to the Territorial Surveying Association invited by the association's new president, a fair-minded man named Harold Gray, who had seen the Carbon County grid implementation and understood what it represented. The presentations were not without resistance. There were men in the association who found the situation either uncomfortable or inadmissible, but there were more who found the technical content genuinely useful, and usefulness, in Annie's experience, had a way of overcoming ideological objections with the patient efficiency of water over stone. In 1882, the territorial governor appointed a committee to study the possibility of standardizing survey methodology across all Wyoming territories. Andrew was appointed to the committee. Annie was invited to present to it, which she did on a November morning with Thomas Edwin, now 18 months old, left in the trusted custody of Mrs. Potts, and she presented her reference grid methodology with the full force of 2 years of implementation data and a clarity of exposition that the committee stenographer later told Sam Pierce was the most precisely argued technical presentation he had personally transcribed. The committee adopted a modified version of the grid system as the recommended standard for new claim documentation in the territory. By the winter of 1882, Annie and Andrew had been married 3 years, and the specific texture of those 3 years was something Annie sometimes tried to describe to herself in the same analytical terms she used for everything else, as a series of mechanisms and structures, but always found that the analysis fell short because the thing she was trying to describe was not structural but relational, which was a category her analysis was equipped to approach but not to contain. What she knew was this: she had come to Wyoming territory alone with $53 and 3 ideas, and she had built something: the patents, the grid system, the licensing contracts, the professional reputation. She had built it exactly as she had intended to build it, and the building of it had been the point, and she had not needed Andrew Alden to build any of it. But what she had with Andrew was different from what she had built alone. It was not the thing that made her possible. She had been entirely possible on her own, as the evidence demonstrated. It was the thing that made her more herself, the way a piece of precision equipment performs better in its proper working environment than it does in conditions of isolation and stress. He knew what she was working on before she told him. He understood the problems without full explanation. He held Thomas Edwin with the same precise care he used for instruments that mattered. He made coffee on the mornings when she was deep in a difficult calculation and set it at her elbow without speaking. He told her once, on a February evening, when the wind was doing the specific Wyoming thing of making the whole world sound like it was coming apart at the seams outside, that he thought she was the most remarkable person he had ever known, and he said it the way he said everything important, simply, without ornamentation, as a fact he was reporting. She had told him she thought he was the person she had been looking for since she was 9 years old, and her father had told her that mathematics was a man's language, which was not the sort of thing she typically said, but which was entirely true. He had looked at her with those dark eyes and the weathered face and said, "Then I'm glad the train went west." In the spring of 1883, a letter arrived from the family of one of the New Mexico families who had lost their land, the Reyes family, whose patriarch had worked with Andrew on the original survey, and whose adult son, Miguel, had been following the federal investigation outcomes in the years since. The letter was addressed to Andrew, but mentioned Annie by name, which Andrew showed her with an expression of careful neutrality that did not fully conceal what it meant to him. The letter said that the federal court's invalidation of the fraudulent claim had given the Reyes family standing to pursue a civil claim against the remaining assets of Territorial Resources Incorporated, the consolidated subsidiary that had executed the falsification. The family had retained a lawyer in Santa Fe. The outcome was not guaranteed, but the door was open, and the door was open because Andrew's documentation, retrieved from a Denver bank vault in December of 1878, had been entered into the federal record by Sam Pierce on a timeline that Walsh had not anticipated. Andrew read the letter twice, then folded it and put it in his desk and was very quiet for most of that day. That evening he said, "It's not enough." "No," Annie said, "but it's real." "It's real," he agreed. She had understood from their earliest conversation that Andrew Alden's dark past was not the kind of dramatic secret that resolved into clean forgiveness and disappeared. It was the kind that you carry honestly and navigate carefully and let inform your work without letting it eat you, and the distinction required constant maintenance and genuine character to sustain. She had watched him sustain it for 5 years. She had watched it make him more careful and more precise and more genuinely committed to the honest work that his profession required. She had watched him build, in Carbon County, Wyoming Territory, a body of survey work that was referenced in 17 formal claim disputes between 1879 and 1883 and found sound in every single instance. In the summer of 1883, Annie was pregnant again, and this time she had calculated the timing with even more deliberate attention to the current project schedule, which made Andrew laugh in the specific private way he laughed, quietly, with his whole face, and she told him to stop laughing at her methodology, and he said he was not laughing at her methodology, but at the fact that he loved her methodology as much as he loved everything else about her, and she decided this was an acceptable answer. Their second child arrived in January of 1884, a girl this time, with Annie's determination already visible in the set of her jaw at approximately 14 hours of age. They named her Clara, for Mrs. Potts, which resulted in Mrs. Potts making a sound that she later denied was related to emotion, and which everyone present recognized immediately as the precise opposite of that claim. Clara Alden was, from the first week, a person of considerable opinions. She shared a room with Thomas, who was by then nearly 3, and had the philosophical acceptance of an older sibling who has absorbed the lesson that the universe does not consult you before expanding. The Warren Avenue house had been expanded by then a room added off the kitchen in the autumn of 1881 by Andrew and Friedrich Bauer over the course of several weekends, using lumber from a Carbon County mill, and a plan that Annie had drawn up with the same attention to structural detail that she brought to every design. The addition gave them a proper nursery and a room that could serve as a guest room when Mrs. Potts stayed over, which she did with increasing frequency as she moved through her late 60s, and the Warren Avenue house became, in some structural way, a secondary home. The 5th patent application was filed in the spring of 1884, a documentation methodology for underground mining claim boundaries, addressing the specific problem of claims that extended below existing surface patents and the legal chaos that resulted from the absence of standardized subsurface boundary documentation. Annie had been working on it intermittently for 2 years, developing the theory, and the 2 children and the ongoing licensing negotiations for the existing patents and the formal work for the Territorial Survey Committee had stretched the development timeline. But the application was thorough and the methodology was sound, and when it was filed, by Annie Thatcher Alden, which was the name on the application, which was her name in full, Nellie the clerk, still at his counter after 6 years, processed it without a word. Sam Pierce, who had observed this transaction, stopped outside on the boardwalk and said, with a satisfaction he made no attempt to conceal, "You know he's retired 3 people from claiming ignorance of the territorial processing laws." "Good," Annie said. Andrew was waiting outside with the wagon Thomas on the seat beside him, Clara in the carrying basket at his feet, both children in the woolens that Greta Bauer had knitted over the winter with the determined productivity of a woman who expressed love in manufactured goods, and whose gifts had kept both Alden children adequately warm through 2 Wyoming winters. Andrew looked up from something Thomas was showing him, a rock of some mineral interest, apparently, and met Annie's eyes and raised an eyebrow in the specific question that had no words. She nodded. He smiled. She climbed up onto the wagon seat on the other side of Thomas, and Andrew handed her Clara and picked up the reins, and they drove down the snow-dusted streets of Cheyenne, Wyoming territory, in the March light of 1884, with 2 children and 5 patents, and a federal investigation that had changed the legal landscape of survey documentation in 2 territories, and an honest surveying business on 18th Street, and a home on Warren Avenue with a door cut between 2 offices, and a friendship with a German machinist and an honest young lawyer and a quiet half-Sioux man who read terrain like a language, and the specific, complete happiness of people who have built exactly what they meant to build and found it stronger than they had dared to plan for. Annie looked at the Laramie Range on the western horizon, snow still on the peaks in March, brilliant and absolute, in the afternoon light, and thought about the morning she had arrived at that horizon on a westbound train with $53 and 3 ideas, and a set of instructions about what was and was not possible in this territory. She thought about the clerk and his contempt, and the papers on the floor, and the man who had walked in behind her with the unhesitating clarity to understand exactly what needed doing. She thought about the specific way the world had arranged itself since then, not the way she had precisely planned it, because life did not work that way, not even for someone who planned with the thoroughness she did, but in a way that was better than the plan, in the way that a mechanism sometimes exceeds its design specifications when it is built with materials of genuine quality. Thomas, sitting between them, was explaining the rock in some detail. Andrew was listening with the full attention he brought to everything worth listening to. Clara had fallen asleep in Annie's arms with the absolute commitment to sleep that infants possess. "The iron content," Thomas said, with the authority of a 3-year-old in possession of a fact, "is why it's red." "Very likely," Andrew said seriously. "Mother knows," Thomas said. "Mother, is it iron?" Annie looked at the rock. It was red sandstone, and the red was iron oxide, and Thomas was correct, and she told him so with the precision of someone who finds it important to be accurate with children, because children deserve accurate information. Thomas received this confirmation with satisfaction, and returned to studying the rock, which was, in his estimation, the most significant geological find of the season. The wagon moved down the street through the March cold and the clean light and the thin dust rising from the wheels, and Annie held her sleeping daughter and looked at her husband and felt the warmth of it, the realness and the solidity, and the specific, mathematical certainty of a life built on honest foundations. She had been told the territory was no place for a woman with ideas. She had filed 5 patents. She had helped clear a man's name from a false record. She had established a survey methodology used across 3 counties. She had built a home and a family and a professional reputation that stood, in the language of the structural engineering she loved, on footing that went below the frost line. She had built all of it in the territory they had said was no place for her. She thought it was, in fact, exactly the place. The wagon turned onto Warren Avenue and the house was ahead of them, the windows lit against the late afternoon, the smoke from the kitchen stove rising straight in the still air, and Mrs. Potts was visible through the front window. She had apparently come by while they were at the land office and let herself in with the key she kept. As she had told Annie, she considered a standing invitation rather than a presumption, and the light was warm and the house was full and the territory stretched in every direction under the winter sky, enormous and cold and full of problems that had not yet been solved. And Annie Thatcher Alden thought, "Good, there is more work to do," and pulled her daughter closer and looked at her husband and was, in every particular, home.